Tonight, we begin a gentle journey into the heart of Zen Buddhism. These are not complicated teachings or difficult techniques to master. They are simple truths about what it means to be human, discovered by masters who spent their lives learning how to find unshakable peace. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. For over 2,000 years, this ancient wisdom has helped countless people discover something remarkable. No matter what storms rage around us, it is possible to remain deeply calm within. No matter how others treat us, we can choose how we respond to them. Tonight, you don't need to try to understand these truths. Simply let them settle into your awareness as you rest, and they will naturally begin to work their quiet change within you. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Let your breathing slow down. Simply rest here and let these ancient truths carry you gently into peace. High in the mountains of ancient China stood a small monastery called Clear Mountain Temple. The buildings were simple, made of weathered wood and grey stone, their curved roofs designed to shed the heavy mountain snows. A young monk named Jinshan had traveled many days to reach this remote place. He had heard stories of the master here, an old monk who seemed untouchable by life's difficulties. People said nothing could disturb his peace. Not criticism, not praise, not even physical pain seemed to affect his inner calm. Jinshan desperately wanted to learn this secret. The master of Clear Mountain Temple was called Wu Wei. His face was weathered like ancient bark, his eyes clear as mountain pools. When Jinshan prostrated himself and begged to learn the deepest secrets of inner peace, Master Wu Wei stroked his grey beard thoughtfully. "You wish to become unshakable?" the master asked. "Yes, master. I have studied many techniques, but I still find myself upset by every small thing. A harsh word from another monk ruins my day. Bad weather makes me irritable. Even the sound of someone chewing loudly can destroy my meditation. I feel weak and unstable." Master Wu Wei nodded slowly. "I understand your struggle. But before I can teach you anything, you must complete a simple task." He pointed through the wooden lattice window toward the towering peak across the valley. "Do you see Thunder Peak Mountain? I want you to watch it during the next storm. Don't try to meditate or practice any technique. Simply observe with your full attention." Jinshan looked puzzled. "Master, how will watching a mountain help me become stronger inside?" "Mountains have much to teach those who pay attention," Wu Wei replied with a gentle smile. "Trust the process." 3 days later, dark clouds began gathering around the mountain peaks. The wind picked up, sending prayer flags snapping wildly outside the monastery windows. Soon the storm arrived with tremendous force. Jinshan positioned himself by the window and watched. Lightning split the sky like angry dragons dancing between the peaks. Thunder rolled through the valleys so loud it seemed the mountains themselves were crying out. Rain fell in sheets so thick he could barely see across the valley. The wind howled with a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. Yet through all this fury, Thunder Peak Mountain remained perfectly still. Lightning struck its summit again and again, illuminating the ancient rock face in brilliant flashes of white light. The wind threw everything it had against the massive stone walls. Rivers of water poured down its sides, carving temporary waterfalls that appeared and disappeared like magic. But the mountain itself never moved. It didn't fight against the lightning or resist the driving rain. It simply remained what it had always been, solid and unmoved, letting the entire storm rage around its unchanging presence. The storm continued for 2 days and 2 nights. When it finally passed, leaving the air crystal clear and sweet with the scent of rain-washed pine, Jinshan went to find Master Wu Wei. He discovered the old monk sitting in the garden, quietly tending to small plants that had been battered by the storm. "Master," Jinshan said, bowing respectfully, "I watched Thunder Peak throughout the entire storm. I think I understand something, but I would be grateful for your guidance." Wu Wei looked up from a small pine seedling he was gently supporting with a thin bamboo stake. "Tell me what you observed." "The mountain remained completely peaceful, even in the fiercest storm I have ever witnessed. Nothing could disturb what it truly was. The lightning, the wind, the flooding rain, it all passed around the mountain without changing it in any way." "And why do you think this was possible?" the master asked, his hands still gentle on the young tree. Jinshan thought carefully before answering. "Because the mountain knew exactly what it was. It wasn't confused about its nature. It wasn't trying to be a tree that could bend or a bird that could fly away. It was simply, completely itself. And somehow, its roots went so deep that nothing could shake it." "Beautiful," Master Wu Wei said, his eyes warm with approval. "The mountain shows us the first secret of true strength. It comes not from fighting against what life brings us, but from knowing who we are so deeply that external storms cannot touch our core." He stood slowly, brushing soil from his robes. "You came seeking techniques for inner peace. But peace is not something you create through effort. It's what you discover when you stop being confused about your own nature." "But Master, how do I find this deep knowing?" "The same way the mountain found its nature," Wu Wei replied. "Not through thinking or analyzing, but through patient sitting, through weathering many storms, through simply being present with whatever arises. Your true self is not something you build. It's what remains when everything false is worn away." This ancient story reveals something profound about human nature that we often forget in our busy, complicated lives. Beneath all our worries, our changing moods, our fears about what others think of us, there exists something solid and unchanging. The mountain represents this deeper part of ourselves. Most of us live our lives identified with surface things. We think we are our job title, our relationships, our successes and failures, our good days and bad days. When these things go well, we feel strong. When they don't, we feel shaken. We're like trees with shallow roots, easily blown over by the first strong wind. But what if there was something deeper? What if the real you, the part that watches your thoughts come and go, the part that has remained constant throughout all the changes of your life, what if that part was as solid and unshakable as a mountain? This is what the Buddha discovered when he sat quietly and looked deeply into the nature of human experience. He found that beneath all the mental noise and emotional storms, there is a place of profound stillness that cannot be touched by external circumstances. Not because it's hiding from life, but because it's so deeply rooted in truth that nothing can disturb it. When we learn to know ourselves from this deeper place, everything changes. Criticism still comes, but it cannot shake us because we're no longer depending on others' approval for our sense of worth. Difficulties still arise, but they become like weather passing through our awareness rather than threats to our very existence. This isn't about becoming cold or disconnected from life. The mountain isn't separate from the storm. It experiences every lightning strike, every drop of rain. but it experiences these things from such a place of deep stability that they cannot overwhelm its essential nature. This is the foundation that makes all other peace practices possible. When you know you have this unshakable core, you can afford to be kind when others are cruel, because their cruelty cannot touch what you truly are. You can afford to stay calm in chaos, because your peace doesn't depend on external order. You can afford to love without guarantee of being loved back, because your completeness doesn't depend on getting something from others. In the hills outside Kyoto, during the early spring when cherry blossoms painted the mountainsides pale pink, stood an ancient temple called Eternal Light. The temple had served travelers for over 300 years, offering shelter, food, and spiritual guidance to anyone who needed it. The temple's keeper was an old monk named Dogen, named after a great master from centuries past. He was a thin man with kind eyes and hands that were permanently stained from years of working in the temple gardens. Dogen had lived at Eternal Light for 40 years, maintaining the buildings, tending the gardens, and keeping the temple lamp burning every single night without fail. One spring evening, a traveling merchant named Takeshi arrived at the temple gates. Takeshi was a successful trader who dealt in silk and tea, traveling regularly between the great cities. He was also a restless man, always seeking new opportunities, better deals, more profitable routes. He had never understood why anyone would choose a life of simple service when they could be out in the world accumulating wealth and status. After sharing the evening meal in the temple's humble dining hall, Takeshi sat with Dogen on the wooden veranda overlooking the valley below. The mountain air was cool and sweet with the scent of blossoming trees. Evening shadows were beginning to stretch across the landscape. "Honorable monk," Takeshi said, setting down his teacup, "I hope you don't find my question rude, but I have always wondered about men like you. You are clearly intelligent and capable. You could live in the capital, teach wealthy students, perhaps even serve in a rich family's household. Why choose such a simple, isolated life?" Dogen was quiet for a long moment, listening to the evening sounds, wind through bamboo, the distant call of a temple bell, water flowing over stones in the garden stream. Finally, he gestured toward the valley spread below them. "Do you see the small lights beginning to appear in the village?" he asked. Takeshi looked where Dogen pointed. In the gathering dusk, warm yellow lights were beginning to glow in windows throughout the valley. Cooking fires, oil lamps, candles, each one a small beacon of human life continuing its daily rhythm. "Yes, I see them," Takeshi replied. "Every evening for 40 years, Dogen said, "I have lit the lamp in our temple hall. In storms that rattled these old buildings like toys, in snow so deep I could barely reach the hall, in illness and in health, I have never once failed to light it." As if to illustrate his point, Dogen rose and moved to a large bronze oil lamp that stood in an alcove on the veranda. With practiced movements born of decades of repetition, he cleaned the wick, filled the reservoir with oil, and lit the flame. Immediately, warm light spread across the veranda and out into the garden, pushing back the approaching darkness. "That light," Dogen continued, settling back down beside Takeshi, "serves as a beacon for travelers who lose their way in these mountains. But more than that, it represents something essential about what it means to be human." A night bird called from somewhere in the darkness, its voice clear and solitary. Fireflies began to blink among the garden plants like tiny stars fallen to earth. "You ask why I choose this life," Dogen said. "But I think the question itself misses something important. I don't experience this as choosing limitation. I experience it as choosing to give my life meaning. Takeshi was beginning to understand, but Dogen continued. Every night when I light that lamp, I am answering the deepest question a human being can ask. How can my life serve something greater than my own small wants and fears? 5. He pointed to the temple lamp, its flame steady and bright in the gathering darkness. That light burns not for me, but for anyone who might need it. The merchant traveling late, the pilgrim who has lost the path, the local farmer walking home after dark. My purpose is to ensure that light never fails when someone needs it. Takeshi looked out at the valley, where more and more lights were appearing as families lit their evening lamps and cooking fires. For the first time, he saw not just individual households going about their business, but a web of human care and service. Each light represented someone choosing to push back a little darkness to create a small space of warmth and safety in the vast night. I have spent my life accumulating things, Takeshi said quietly. Silk, tea, gold, reputation. But none of these things have given me the contentment I see in your face. How do you find such peace in having so little? Dogen smiled. I think you see it backwards, my friend. I don't have little. I have everything that truly matters. I have work that serves others. I have days filled with meaning. I have the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing my life makes a difference, even if it's a small one. The next morning, as Takeshi prepared to continue his journey, he watched Dogen move through his morning routines. He saw him carefully clean the lamp from the night before, trim the wick, and prepare it for another evening of service. 5. He watched him tend the temple gardens, sweep the pathways, and prepare simple meals for any travelers who might arrive. For the first time in his life, Takeshi glimpsed something that his constant seeking for personal advantage had never shown him. He saw a man who had found perfect contentment, not by getting more, but by discovering how much he had to give. As he walked down the mountain path toward the main road, Takeshi looked back once to see Dogen in the temple garden, moving peacefully among the flowering trees, completely at home in a life devoted to something larger than himself. Dogen's story shows us something beautiful about human nature that our culture often overlooks. We're taught to believe that happiness comes from accumulating things for ourselves, from achieving status, from getting more of what we want. But deep down, most of us sense that real fulfillment comes from the opposite direction, from discovering what we have to offer the world. When we're living for something larger than our personal desires, we're no longer carrying the impossible burden of trying to make ourselves happy through external means. We're no longer depending on getting specific outcomes to feel worthwhile. Our sense of meaning comes from the giving itself, not from whether we receive appreciation or recognition in return. The Buddha understood this deeply. He spent his life teaching not because he needed to be seen as a great teacher, but because he had discovered something so valuable that keeping it to himself would have been like hiding a lamp under a blanket. His sense of purpose came from the offering, not from the results. When you find this connection, when you discover what you're genuinely called to tend and nurture, you've found the foundation of unshakable peace. Not because life stops bringing challenges, but because those challenges become part of your practice rather than threats to your happiness. Your life becomes like Dogen's temple, a place where your inner light burns steadily, offering warmth and guidance to anyone who needs it. And like that mountain in the storm, you remain unmoved by external turbulence because you're rooted in something deeper than personal circumstances. You're rooted in the natural human joy of being useful, of mattering, of making the world a little better through your presence in it. Let your breathing deepen now. Feel yourself settling more completely into rest. Notice how good it feels to simply be here, needing nothing more than this moment of peace. Tomorrow will bring its own opportunities to serve, to give, to be the lamp that lights a small corner of the world. For now, rest in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that you have everything you need to live a meaningful life. The capacity to love, to serve, to be present with whatever comes. These gifts are already yours, and no external circumstance can take them away. In the bustling marketplace of ancient Hangzhou, where merchants sold silk and spices beneath colorful awnings, where the air was thick with the scent of incense and the sound of haggling voices, a monk named Huineng walked quietly among the stalls. He was a simple man, dressed in plain brown robes that had been mended many times. His head was shaved in the traditional way, and he carried only a small cloth bag for the few items he needed. Huineng had come to the marketplace not for himself, but to buy rice and vegetables for the small monastery where he lived with 12 other monks. The monastery was poor, and they depended on donations and careful shopping to make their meager funds last. Huineng moved slowly through the crowded marketplace, stopping at each stall to examine the goods with gentle care. The morning sun was warm on his shoulders, and he took his time, appreciating the colors and textures of the fresh produce, the skill of the craftspeople, the energy of commerce flowing around him. At one vegetable stand, he picked up several cabbages, feeling their weight, checking each leaf for freshness. The vendor, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, watched him nervously as he examined each cabbage with what seemed like excessive care. "Are you going to buy anything, or just handle all my vegetables until they're bruised?" She snapped, her voice sharp with irritation. "I have other customers waiting, and you're taking forever." Huineng looked up at her with genuine warmth in his eyes. "Please forgive me for being slow," he said kindly. "These cabbages are beautiful. I would like these 3, please." He placed the best ones carefully in his bag and offered payment with a small bow. The woman took the money without another word, already turning to the next customer. At the rice merchant's stall, Huineng took even more time, running the grains through his fingers with the careful attention of someone who understood how precious food could be. He was checking for stones and chaff, making sure the rice would cook properly for his community. This merchant, a heavy-set man with sweat beading on his forehead, watched with growing impatience. "What are you, some kind of expert?" he said loudly, drawing attention from other shoppers. "You monks think you're so special, examining everything like you're buying for the emperor himself. If you can't afford good rice, then buy the cheap stuff and stop wasting my time." Other people in the marketplace began to turn and stare. Some whispered among themselves, pointing at the monk who was causing such a commotion. A few looked embarrassed by the merchant's rudeness, but no one spoke up. Huineng continued his careful examination, his expression unchanged, as peaceful as a mountain lake reflecting clouds. He seemed completely unaware that he had become the center of unwanted attention. Finally, a wealthy silk merchant named Zhang Wei, who had been watching this scene unfold with growing irritation, could contain his anger no longer. Zhang Wei was known throughout the marketplace for his expensive clothes, his quick temper, and his sharp tongue. He strode over to where Huineng knelt, examining rice. "You know what your problem is, monk?" Zhang Wei said, loud enough for half the marketplace to hear. His face was red with righteous indignation. "You're arrogant. You think because you shave your head and wear those rags that you're somehow better than the rest of us. But you're just a beggar, looking for handouts and pretending to be holy." The marketplace grew quiet. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the vendors paused their selling to watch this confrontation. Everyone within hearing distance expected drama. Some looked excited, anticipating the monk's defense. Others looked uncomfortable, uncertain what would happen next. Huineng finished selecting his rice with the same careful attention he had shown throughout the morning. He paid the merchant, counted out the correct coins slowly and precisely, and carefully placed the bag of rice in his cloth sack. Only then did he turn to face Jiang Wei. His face showed no anger, no embarrassment, no defensiveness. His eyes were as calm as they had been when he first entered the marketplace, like deep pools that reflected everything but were disturbed by nothing. "Thank you for sharing your thoughts with me," Huineng said simply, his voice warm and genuine. "I hope the rest of your day brings you much happiness and prosperity." Jiang Wei was taken aback. He had thrown his hardest punch and hit nothing but air. "Is that all you have to say?" he asked, his voice filled with frustration. "Aren't you going to defend yourself? Aren't you angry?" "From what should I defend myself?" 0. 5. Huineng asked with what seemed like genuine curiosity. "You have expressed your opinion about me. That is certainly your right. Your words belong to you, just as my peace belongs to me." "But I called you arrogant. I called you a beggar," Jiang Wei stammered, confused by this response he had never encountered before. Huineng nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this information for the first time. "Yes, I heard what you said. But tell me, honored sir, if someone offers you a gift and you choose not to accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" Jiang Wei frowned, confused by the question and frustrated that the conversation had taken this strange turn. "Well, it belongs to the person who offered it, I suppose." "Exactly so," Huineng said with a warm smile that seemed to include not just Jiang Wei, but the entire crowd that had gathered. "You have offered me the gifts of anger and harsh judgment, but I choose not to accept them. Therefore, they remain with you. I hope you will find a better use for them than offering them to strangers." With that, Huineng bowed politely to Jiang Wei, then to the rice merchant, and finally to the small crowd that had gathered. He picked up his bag of provisions and continued peacefully through the marketplace, stopping to make a few more purchases with the same unhurried care he had shown all morning. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many of them whispering about what they had just witnessed. Some shook their heads in amazement. Others looked thoughtful, as if something they had always believed had just been quietly overturned. Jiang Wei stood alone in the middle of the marketplace, holding his anger like a burning coal, realizing for the first time in his life that no one had forced him to pick it up. This simple encounter in an ancient marketplace reveals something profound about human freedom that most of us never discover. We spend our lives believing that other people have the power to make us angry, to hurt our feelings, to ruin our day. But this is an illusion that keeps us trapped in emotional reactivity. The truth that Huineng demonstrated is this: there is always a space between what happens to us and how we respond. Most people react so quickly that they never notice this space exists. Someone insults them and anger appears instantly, as if it were an automatic response. Someone criticizes them and hurt feelings seem to arise by themselves. as if they had no choice in the matter. But this automation is just a habit, not a law of nature. In that tiny gap between stimulus and response lives our freedom. When we learn to find that space and rest there, we discover that we are much more powerful than we ever imagined. This starts with simply noticing the gap between event and reaction. The next time someone speaks harshly to you or treats you rudely, try to catch yourself in that moment before you automatically respond. Take one conscious breath. In that breath, you can choose how to respond rather than just reacting from habit. Ask yourself, what is this person really offering me right now? Usually, they're offering you their own emotional state. Their stress, their frustration, their judgments, their fears. You can accept these offerings and make them your own, or you can politely decline and let them keep what belongs to them. This isn't about being perfect or never feeling hurt. It's about gradually developing the capacity to choose your emotional responses rather than having them chosen for you by whoever happens to be having a bad day around you. It's about becoming the author of your own inner experience rather than letting it be written by random external events. When you master this art of non-acceptance, you become truly untouchable. Not because you've built walls around your heart, but because you've learned to let other people's emotions pass through you without sticking. Like Huineng in the marketplace, you can move through life with an open heart and a peaceful mind, touched by everything but disturbed by nothing. In the mountains of northern China, where autumn painted the maple trees brilliant red and gold, stood a small temple called Peaceful Valley. The temple was home to only 5 monks, led by an elderly master named Yunmen, who had been practicing meditation for over 50 years. His face was deeply lined from decades of sitting in contemplation, but his eyes held a lightness that seemed untouched by age. One of the youngest monks in the temple was called Joshu. He was earnest in his practice and worked hard to live up to the standards of monastic life, but he struggled with something that made his spiritual progress difficult. He cared deeply about what others thought of him. During meditation, Joshu's mind would often fill with worries about whether he was progressing fast enough, whether the other monks respected him, whether his understanding was deep enough, whether he belonged in this sacred place. These concerns followed him like shadows, coloring every interaction and stealing his peace. Every morning, following ancient tradition, the monks would walk to the nearby village to collect alms. They would move through the streets with their begging bowls, accepting whatever food the villagers could spare. It was a humble practice that kept the temple running while maintaining the connection between the monastery and the community it served. On one particular autumn morning, as Joshu walked through the village with his wooden bowl, the morning air crisp with the promise of winter, he overheard 2 women talking by a stone well. They were washing vegetables for their family's morning meals, their voices carrying clearly in the still mountain air. "Do you see that young monk over there?" one woman said, pointing discreetly in Joshu's direction. She was middle-aged, with graying hair pulled back severely and hands reddened from the cold water. "My cousin, who lives near the temple, told me some interesting things about him." The second woman, younger but with the same sharp expression, looked over at Joshu and nodded with interest. "Oh? What did she say?" "She says he's lazy," the first woman continued, lowering her voice, but not enough to prevent Joshu from hearing every word. "Sleeps late, doesn't work as hard as the others. And look how young he island. What could someone that age possibly know about spiritual matters?" Joshu felt his face burning with shame and anger. Every word was completely untrue. He rose before dawn every day for meditation, often sitting longer than anyone else. He worked harder than most in the temple gardens, tending vegetables and maintaining the grounds with meticulous care. He had given up a comfortable life with his family to pursue awakening with complete sincerity. "I agree completely," the second woman replied, scrubbing a radish with unnecessary force. "When I was a girl, monks were truly holy men who had earned their robes through years of genuine sacrifice. This one probably became a monk just to avoid having to work for a living. Young people today have no dedication." "Exactly," the first woman said, warming to her theme. "It's a disgrace, really. The temple used to be filled with masters of great wisdom. Now they take anyone who shows up at their gate." Joshu's first impulse was to march over to the women and defend himself, to tell them how wrong they were, to explain his true dedication and the sacrifices he had made. His second impulse was to return immediately to the temple and hide from any further humiliation. Instead, he forced himself to continue his rounds, but the women's words echoed in his mind like painful bells. Each cruel phrase seemed to carve itself deeper into his memory. By the time he returned to Peaceful Valley, his usual calm had completely disappeared. His mind was a storm of defensive arguments, hurt feelings, and angry retorts he wished he had made. Master Yunmen was sitting in the temple garden when Joshu returned, carefully tending to a small pine tree that grew in a large ceramic pot. The old master's movements were slow and deliberate, each gesture an act of meditation. He looked up as Joshu approached, and his experienced eyes immediately saw the young monk's distressed state. "Sit with me," Yunmen said simply, patting the ground beside him. Joshu sat down heavily, his movements sharp with residual anger. For several minutes, they sat in silence, while Yunmen continued his work with the small tree, gently adjusting its position to catch the slanted autumn sunlight, carefully removing dead needles with loving attention. "Tell me what has disturbed your peace," Yunmen said finally, his voice as gentle as wind through leaves. Joshu related the entire encounter, repeating the women's words exactly as he had heard them. As he spoke, his anger rekindled, his voice becoming tight with indignation and hurt. "Master, what they said was completely false. I work harder than anyone here. I'm completely sincere in my practice. How dare they judge me without knowing anything about my life or my commitment?" Yunmen nodded thoughtfully and continued working with his tree, trimming a small branch with careful precision. After a long pause, he spoke. "Tell me, Joshu, when you practice archery and shoot an arrow at a target, what do you do if you miss?" Joshu was confused by the question, uncertain how it related to his problem. I examine my aim and try again, Master." "Good. And if someone else shoots an arrow at that same target and also misses, does their failure affect your next shot?" "No, Master. Their arrow has nothing to do with mine." "Exactly," Yunmen said, his eyes twinkling with gentle humor. "Those women shot arrows of criticism at their idea of who you are. But their arrows missed the target completely because they were aiming at an imaginary person, not the real Joshu." He gently adjusted another small branch on the pine tree. "But you caught their arrows in mid-flight and decided to make them yours. Now you are wounded by arrows that were never meant for you, shot by people who don't even know you exist." Joshu sat quietly, feeling something shift inside his chest, like a tight knot slowly beginning to loosen. "But Master, How do I not take such things personally when they use my name and point directly at me? Yunmen smiled, setting down his small gardening tools. The same way this pine tree doesn't take it personally when children throw stones at it. The tree knows what it island. It doesn't need the children's approval to be a tree. It doesn't become less of a tree because of their actions. He looked directly at his student. Your job is to know yourself so clearly that others' mistaken opinions cannot shake your understanding of who you are. Those women created a fictional character in their minds and gave him your name. Why should you be hurt by criticism of someone who doesn't exist? This teaching story reveals something crucial about human suffering that we rarely understand clearly. Most of the emotional pain we experience doesn't come from what actually happens to us, but from the stories we tell ourselves about what those events mean. Joshu heard certain sounds, vibrations in the air that we call words. That was the actual event. But his mind immediately created an elaborate story about what these sounds meant. This proves I'm not good enough. This means I don't belong here. Everyone must think I'm a fraud. This story became the source of his suffering, much more painful than the original experience. This is how the human mind works when it's not trained. It takes neutral events and wraps them in layers of interpretation, meaning, and emotional significance. Someone doesn't return your phone call, and your mind creates a story about rejection. Someone gives you feedback at work, and your mind creates a story about your incompetence. Someone seems distracted when you're talking, and your mind creates a story about your lack of importance. But these stories are just that, stories. They're not facts about reality. They're interpretations created by a mind that is trying to protect you, but often creates more problems than it solves. The freedom that Yunmen taught Joshu is the freedom to distinguish between what actually happens and the stories we tell ourselves about what happens. This distinction is one of the most practical and immediately useful insights you can develop. When you hear criticism, you can ask yourself, what actually happened here? What were the bare facts? Often you'll discover that the actual event was much smaller and less threatening than your interpretation of it. Someone expressed an opinion. Someone revealed their mood or their limitations. Someone showed you their level of understanding. These are just facts, like weather patterns, not personal attacks on your essential worth. Most criticism tells you more about the critic than about the person being criticized. Those women at the well weren't really talking about Joshu. They were expressing their own judgments, their own ideas about how young people should behave, their own nostalgia for an imagined past when everything was better. Their words revealed their mental habits, not objective truth about anyone else. When you understand this, criticism becomes much less personal and much more interesting. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" you can ask, "What does this tell me about how this person sees the world?" Instead of defending yourself, you can simply observe the other person's perspective with curiosity, like watching an interesting weather pattern pass through the sky. This doesn't mean dismissing all feedback or becoming arrogant about your own limitations. Useful criticism, offered with genuine care and based on accurate observation, can be valuable for growth. But you learn to distinguish between feedback that comes from wisdom and love and projection that comes from others' unresolved issues. The practice is to develop such a clear understanding of your own nature that you become like Yunmen's pine tree, rooted in truth rather than in other people's opinions. When you know who you are, what your intentions are, how hard you're trying, what your actual strengths and limitations are, then other people's random judgments can't shake your foundation. This kind of self-knowledge doesn't come from thinking about yourself or analyzing your personality. It comes from the simple practice of honest self-observation without judgment. You learn to see yourself clearly, your genuine efforts and your actual mistakes, your real progress and your remaining blind spots, your authentic motivations and your ego-driven reactions. When this self-knowledge becomes solid, you develop what we might call emotional immunity. Not because you stop caring about others or become callous to feedback, but because you're no longer dependent on external validation to know your own worth. You can hear what others say about you without immediately making it about your identity. This creates tremendous inner freedom. You can engage with life fully, take appropriate risks, express yourself authentically because you're no longer terrified of what others might think or say. You know that their reactions to you reveal their inner landscape, not your actual value as a human being. 0. 5. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, if any harsh words or critical comments from your day arise in your mind, practice seeing them as Yunmen taught Joshu to see them. Someone shot arrows at their idea of who you are, but these arrows never touched your true nature. Your worth is not determined by random opinions from people who don't really know you. Let these arrows fall harmlessly to the ground where they belong, and allow your mind to return to the peaceful awareness that is your true home. Feel your body softening as you release the need to carry other people's judgments with you into sleep. You are like that pine tree, rooted in your own nature, unmoved by the stones that children throw. Rest in this understanding, and let the deep peace of knowing who you are carry you gently through the night. In the famous Shaolin temple, nestled in the Song Mountains of central China, there lived a monk who had become legendary for his extraordinary garden. Brother Huiming had spent 20 years transforming a small plot of rocky, barren ground behind the temple's main hall into what many considered a miracle of cultivation. The garden was renowned throughout the region not just for its beauty, but for its remarkable productivity. Even in the harshest seasons, when drought withered other gardens or floods washed away careful plantings, Huiming's plot continued to provide abundant vegetables and herbs for the temple community. Travelers would journey from distant provinces just to see how he achieved such success in such challenging conditions. The garden itself was a marvel of organization and care. Neat rows of vegetables grew in perfect alignment, each plant healthy and vigorous. Fruit trees provided shade and sweet offerings. Herb spirals released their fragrance into the mountain air. Everything seemed to thrive under Huiming's attention, as if the very soil had been blessed. The secret, Huiming would tell anyone who asked, lay not in any special technique or secret fertilizer, but in constant, patient attention to what was allowed to grow and what needed to be removed before it could cause problems. Every morning before dawn, while the other monks were still settling into their meditation hall, Huiming would walk slowly through his garden with a small oil lamp, its flame flickering gently in the morning breeze. Row by row, plant by plant, he would examine every inch of soil with the careful attention of someone reading a sacred text. When he found young weeds beginning to sprout between his carefully planted vegetables, he would remove them immediately while their roots were still small and weak. When he discovered insects that might damage his plants, he would gently relocate them to wild areas outside the temple grounds where they could find food without destroying his crops. When he saw signs of plant disease, he would treat it before it could spread to healthy growth. The key to a productive garden, he would explain to the young monks who came to learn from him, is not to wait until problems become obvious. By then, removing them often damages the good plants around them. The secret is daily attention, catching difficulties when they are still small and easy to address. One spring, a young monk named Faxiang was assigned to help Huaiming with the garden work. Faxiang was intelligent and eager to learn, but he had grown up in the city and knew nothing about growing things. He was amazed by the amount of time Huaiming spent simply walking through the garden, looking carefully at each plant, seeming to do nothing but observe. Master Huaiming, Faxiang said one morning as they worked together in the warming sunshine, wouldn't it be more efficient to weed the entire garden once a week rather than checking it every single day? It seems like we're doing the same work over and over again. Huaiming smiled and knelt beside a row of young lettuce plants, their tender green leaves just beginning to spread in the rich soil. "Look closely here," he said, pointing to what appeared to be empty earth between the lettuce seedlings. "What do you see?" Faxiang bent down and looked carefully, but saw only dark, rich soil. "I see nothing, Master." "Exactly," Huaiming said, taking a small pointed stick and gently scraping away a thin layer of earth. There, barely visible to the untrained eye, were tiny green shoots just beginning to emerge from the soil. "These are dandelion seeds that blew in yesterday on the evening wind. Tomorrow, you would see them clearly. In a week, they would be difficult to remove without disturbing the lettuce roots. In a month, they would completely take over this row." He carefully extracted each tiny weed with the tip of his stick, his movements precise and gentle. "The mind is exactly like this garden, young brother. Negative thoughts are like weed seeds, constantly blowing in from the outside world through our conversations, our reading, our interactions with others. If we wait until these thoughts are fully grown before we deal with them, they become much harder to remove, and the process often disturbs our inner peace." Faxiang was beginning to understand, but Huaiming continued his lesson as they moved to the next row. "Every day, people will say things that could plant seeds of anger in your mind. You will hear gossip that could grow into harsh judgment of others. You will encounter situations that could sprout into worry or fear about the future. The practice is to catch these mental weeds when they first appear, before they can establish themselves and spread." That afternoon, Faxiang had his first opportunity to apply this teaching. While working quietly in the garden, pulling actual weeds from around the tomato plants, he overheard two visiting monks talking in low voices near the garden gate. They were discussing the temple's abbot, and their words were not kind. "The old master is getting soft," one was saying to the other. "Did you see how gently he corrected that young monk who was sleeping during morning meditation? In my old temple, such behavior would have resulted in immediate punishment." "I agree," the second visitor replied. "The discipline here isn't what it used to be. These young monks need a firmer hand, or they'll never develop real commitment to the practice." Immediately, Faxiang felt a small seed of agreement beginning to sprout in his mind. "Yes," he thought, "perhaps the abbot was too lenient. Perhaps the discipline here wasn't strict enough compared to other places. Perhaps he wasn't being challenged enough in his own practice. Perhaps." Then he remembered Huaiming's morning lesson about mental weeds. This was exactly what the master had described. These critical thoughts about the abbot and the temple were like dandelion seeds, small and almost invisible now, but capable of growing into a forest of dissatisfaction and judgment that would disturb his peace and poison his relationships with the community. Gently, Like removing a tiny weed before it could establish roots, Faxiang acknowledged the critical thoughts without feeding them with more thinking. He neither fought against them nor elaborated on them. He simply noticed them arising and chose not to water them with his attention, returning his focus instead to the physical work of tending the actual garden. That evening, as they cleaned their tools in the slanted light of sunset, Huaiming looked at his young student with quiet approval. "I see you understood today's lesson in more than just gardening," he said quietly. Faxiang nodded, feeling a deep satisfaction he had never experienced before. "The weeds want to grow in both kinds of gardens, don't they, Master?" 0. 5. "Yes," Huaiming replied, setting his tools carefully in their proper places. But a skilled gardener learns to tend both with the same patient attention and gentle wisdom. This simple story reveals one of the most practical and immediately useful teachings in all of human wisdom, the understanding that we must actively protect our mental environment from harmful influences, just as a gardener protects their plants from weeds and pests. Most of us go through life completely unconscious of what we're allowing to take root in our minds. We absorb negative thoughts from conversations, media, random interactions, and our own mental habits without realizing that these thoughts will grow and multiply if we don't address them consciously. We wonder why we feel anxious, critical, or dissatisfied, not recognizing that we've been unconsciously cultivating these states through mental negligence. The insight that Huaiming shared with Faxiang is profound. Timing matters enormously when it comes to mental cultivation. When a negative thought first appears, it's like those barely visible dandelion shoots, easy to remove without disturbing our peace. But if we allow these thoughts to grow by feeding them with attention, analysis, and elaboration, they become like established weeds with deep roots, much more difficult to uproot without causing inner turmoil. This is why the Buddha emphasized the importance of mindfulness, paying attention to what's happening in the mind moment by moment. Not to judge our thoughts or suppress them forcefully, but to develop the wisdom to recognize which mental states serve our well-being and which ones lead us towards suffering. When someone criticizes you harshly, that's the first arrow, the actual event. But then your mind might begin generating thoughts like, "They're right, I am incompetent," or "How dare they speak to me that way," or "Everyone probably agrees with them." These secondary thoughts are like weed seeds that can grow into forests of self-doubt, anger, or paranoia if we're not careful. The practice Huaiming teaches is not about suppressing thoughts or pretending that negative things don't happen. It's about developing the subtle awareness to catch unhelpful thoughts early before they can establish themselves and dominate our inner landscape. When a critical thought about someone arises, we can observe it without immediately accepting it as truth. When worry about the future begins to sprout, we can acknowledge it without feeding it with elaborate scenarios and mental movies. This requires the same kind of gentle, daily attention that Huaiming brought to his garden. Throughout the day, we can periodically check in with our mental state. What thoughts are taking root here? What emotions are beginning to establish themselves? Are these mental formations leading toward peace and clarity, or toward agitation and confusion? When we notice harmful thoughts beginning to grow, we can practice what might be called skillful abandoning. This is not violent suppression, which often makes thoughts stronger, but gentle redirection. We acknowledge the thought without judgment, recognize that it doesn't serve our well-being, and calmly return our attention to something more constructive. Just as Huaiming would gently relocate harmful insects rather than killing them, we can redirect our mental energy rather than fighting against our own minds. When we catch ourselves rehearsing an argument with someone, we can gently guide our attention back to the present moment. When we notice ourselves building elaborate worry scenarios, we can lovingly return our focus to what we can actually control right now. This practice requires patience and consistency, just like tending a physical garden. We cannot weed the mind once and expect it to remain clear forever. Mental cultivation is a daily practice, a continuous process of mindful attention to what we allow to flourish in the sacred space of our awareness. The goal is not to achieve a mind completely free of negative thoughts, which would be both impossible and unnecessary. Difficult thoughts and emotions are natural responses to challenging situations. The goal is to develop such clear awareness of our mental processes that harmful thoughts cannot establish themselves and take over our inner landscape. We become like skilled gardeners who can quickly identify and address problems before they spread. This understanding also applies to our consumption of information and our choice of mental diet. Just as a gardener is careful about what seeds enter their garden, we can be mindful about what influences we allow into our mental environment. What do we read, watch, and discuss? How do these inputs affect our inner state? Are we consciously choosing mental nutrition that supports our growth, or unconsciously consuming mental junk food that creates agitation and confusion? 0. 5. When we take responsibility for cultivating our minds with the same care that Huaiming brought to his garden, we create the conditions for natural peace and contentment to flourish. Our inner landscape becomes a source of strength rather than a source of stress, a refuge we can always return to regardless of what storms may be raging in the external world. High in the mountains of Tibet, where the air was so clear that every breath felt like drinking light, stood a small hermitage called Cloud Walker Monastery. The monastery was built on a narrow ledge carved into the cliff face, its simple stone buildings seeming to float between earth and sky. It was home to only 3 monks, led by an ancient master named Tenzin, whose white beard flowed like a waterfall and whose eyes held the depth of mountain lakes. One of the monks was a middle-aged man named Norbu, who had come to the monastery after a difficult life in the valleys below. Before taking robes, Norbu had been a successful merchant, traveling between villages with pack animals loaded with goods. But he had lost everything through a combination of bad weather, bandit attacks, and the betrayal of a business partner he had trusted like a brother. Even after 2 years of monastic life, Norbu struggled with persistent mental visitors that seemed to arrive uninvited. During meditation, his mind would often drift into memories of his former wealth, anger at the partner who had cheated him, and deep worry about whether he had made the right decision in leaving worldly life behind. These thoughts had become so familiar that he barely noticed them anymore, like background noise that colored his entire experience of monastery life. The patterns were always the same. In the morning, as he tried to settle into meditation, memories of his prosperous past would arise. The fine clothes he once wore, the respect he had commanded in the marketplace, the security of knowing he could provide for his family. These memories brought a bittersweet longing that made his simple monastic life feel small and limited. By afternoon, the memories would shift to anger. He would relive scenes of discovering his partner's betrayal, imagine conversations where he confronted the man more forcefully, rehearse arguments he wished he had made. The anger felt righteous and energizing, but it also left him feeling hollow and disconnected from his spiritual practice. Evenings brought worry and self-doubt. Had he been a fool to trust his partner? Was he being a fool now to think he could find peace in monastic life? Maybe he should return to the world and try to rebuild what he had lost. Maybe he wasn't cut out for this contemplative path. Maybe he was just running away from his failures rather than facing them courageously. These mental patterns had become so habitual that Norbu rarely questioned them. They felt like natural responses to his circumstances, automatic features of his inner landscape that he had no choice but to endure. One afternoon, while Norbu was sweeping the monastery's small courtyard and lost in particularly painful memories about his business failure, Master Tenzin approached and sat quietly on a simple wooden bench nearby. The old master often did this, simply sitting in companionable silence while the monks went about their daily work, his presence both unobtrusive and deeply calming. After several minutes of shared silence, with only the sound of Norbu's broom against stone and the distant cry of mountain eagles, Tenzin spoke in his soft, clear voice. "Tell me, Brother Norbu, what do you see when you look up at that sky?" Norbu paused in his sweeping and looked up. Above them stretched a vast expanse of brilliant blue, dotted with white clouds that drifted slowly across the mountain peaks like sailing ships on an azure sea. "I see clouds, Master. Many beautiful clouds against the blue sky." "How many clouds can you count?" Norbu looked more carefully, shading his eyes against the bright mountain Sunday. "Perhaps 15 or 20, Master. They seem to change, even as I watch them." "And tell me, which of those clouds were there yesterday at this same time?" Norbu thought for a moment, trying to remember. I don't recall exactly, Master. The clouds are always changing, always moving to new places." "Yes," Tenzin said with a gentle smile that seemed to include the entire sky in its warmth. "The clouds are always in motion, always different. Each one arises, takes shape, and dissolves back into empty space. But what about the sky itself? Does the sky change?" Norbu looked up again, this time paying attention to the vast blue expanse that held all the clouds. "The sky remains the same, Master. It's always present, always open, always peaceful." "Exactly so," Tenzin said, rising slowly from the bench. "Now, tell me, when you sit in meditation, what do you observe in your mind?" "I see many thoughts, Master. Memories of my past life, feelings of anger and regret, worries about the future. Sometimes it feels like my entire mind is filled with these experiences." "And are these the same thoughts you had yesterday? The same memories and worries?" Norbu considered this carefully. He had never really paid attention to this aspect of his mental experience. "No, Master. The specific thoughts change, though they often have similar themes. Sometimes I remember different events. Sometimes the worries focus on different possibilities." "Like clouds in the sky," Tenzin said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had observed these patterns for decades. "Always changing, always moving, sometimes dense and stormy, sometimes light and wispy. But tell me, what is it that observes these thoughts? What is aware of the memories and worries as they pass through your mind?" This question stopped Norbu completely. In all his years of struggling with difficult thoughts, he had never considered what was doing the observing. He had been so focused on the content of his thoughts that he had never noticed the awareness that was perceiving them. I'm not sure, Master. I never thought about this before." "Look carefully now," Tenzin said, his voice becoming even softer, as if he were sharing a precious secret. "Right now, you are aware of my words. You are aware of the feeling of the broom handle in your hands. You are aware of thoughts arising and passing away in your mind. What is this awareness itself like? Does it come and go like the thoughts do? Does it change like the clouds? Norbu stood very still, turning his attention inward for the first time in a completely new way. Instead of focusing on the content of his thoughts, he tried to notice the awareness that was perceiving them. Gradually, he began to sense something vast and unchanging, like the blue sky that held all the passing clouds. The awareness, it seems always present, Master. It doesn't seem to be disturbed by the thoughts that pass through it, even the painful ones. Yes, Tenzin said with deep satisfaction, his eyes sparkling with joy at his student's recognition. The thoughts and emotions are like clouds, temporary formations that arise and dissolve in the space of awareness. But you are not the clouds. You are the sky itself, vast and peaceful, untouched by whatever weather patterns may pass through. He gestured toward the mountain peaks around them, their snow-covered summits gleaming in the afternoon sunday. When storm clouds gather around these mountains, do the clouds damage the peaks? When strong winds blow the clouds away, do the mountains try to hold on to them? 0, 5. No, Master. The mountains simply allow the weather to come and go naturally. Your true nature is like those mountains, like that sky, Brother Norbu. Your thoughts about the past, your anger at your former partner, your worries about the future, they are all just weather patterns passing through the vast space of your awareness. They cannot damage who you truly are unless you mistake yourself for the passing weather rather than the eternal sky. That evening, during the monastery's evening meditation, Norbu practiced this new way of relating to his mental experience. When familiar memories of his business life arose, instead of getting caught up in the story, he practiced observing them as temporary clouds passing through the sky of awareness. When anger toward his former partner surfaced, he watched it like weather, noting its arising and its inevitable passing away. For the first time in years, Norbu experienced periods of profound peace during meditation, not because his thoughts stopped arising, but because he stopped identifying with them completely. He was the sky, vast and unchanging, simply allowing all experiences to pass through without resistance or attachment. This profound story points to perhaps the deepest insight in all of human wisdom, the recognition that we are not our thoughts and emotions, but the awareness in which they arise and pass away. Most of us live with the unconscious assumption that we are the voice in our head, the stream of thoughts and mental commentary that provides continuous narration about our experience. We identify so completely with this mental activity that we forget there is something deeper, something that remains constant while all these mental formations come and go. This deeper identity is like Tenzin's sky, vast, open and undisturbed by whatever appears within it. When we recognize this distinction between the content of consciousness and consciousness itself, it becomes one of the most liberating realizations possible. When Norbu was caught in his painful memories and regrets, he was completely identified with the content of his thoughts. He believed that his memories were happening to him now, in the present moment, causing fresh suffering each time they arose. But memories are not present moment experiences, they are mental formations, like clouds, that appear in the sky of awareness and then dissolve. This understanding reveals what true letting go actually means. It's not about suppressing thoughts or emotions, but about changing our relationship to them. When we recognize that we are the sky rather than the clouds, we can allow difficult experiences to arise without being overwhelmed by them. We can acknowledge pain without adding the extra layer of suffering that comes from resisting the pain or making it into a story about our identity. In practical terms, this means developing the ability to observe our mental activity without immediately believing or acting on every thought that arises. When a thought of worry about the future appears, we can note worrying and recognize it as a temporary mental formation rather than an accurate prediction. When a memory of past hurt surfaces, we can observe remembering without being pulled back into the emotional state associated with that memory. This practice is simple but not always easy. It requires patience and gentle persistence. Throughout the day, when you notice yourself caught up in stressful thoughts, you can pause and ask, who is aware of this stress? What is observing these worried thoughts? This question naturally shifts your identity from the content of your experience to the awareness that perceives it. The key insight is that thoughts and emotions are temporary phenomena. They arise due to causes and conditions, persist for a time, and then naturally dissolve. But the awareness that perceives them is constant and unchanging. When you learn to rest your sense of identity in this deeper awareness, rather than in the changing contents of mind, you discover an unshakable peace that no external circumstance can disturb. This doesn't mean becoming passive or indifferent to life. The sky doesn't ignore the clouds, it simply doesn't struggle against them. Similarly, when you understand your true nature as awareness itself, you can engage fully with life's experiences without being tossed about by every mental and emotional wind. The practice is to regularly remember this deeper identity throughout your day. When you notice yourself lost in mental stories about the past or future, you can gently return to present moment awareness. When you find yourself struggling against difficult emotions, you can remember that you are the vast space in which these emotions are arising, not the emotions themselves. This recognition gradually transforms how you relate to all challenging experiences. Anxiety becomes simply another weather pattern in the sky of awareness. Anger arises and passes away like a summer storm. Sadness moves through like morning mist, leaving the sky clear and bright. This understanding is not a philosophy to believe in, but a direct experience to discover for yourself. Right now, as you listen to these words, notice that something is aware of the listening. Notice that something observes your thoughts about what you're hearing. That aware presence is your true nature, always available, always peaceful, always home. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, you can practice settling into this sky-like awareness. Notice any thoughts or concerns from the day that may still be active in your mind. Instead of engaging with their content, practice observing them as temporary formations in the vast space of consciousness. Let them come and go like clouds, while you remain as the unchanging sky that holds them all. Your essential nature is this pure awareness, vast and peaceful, untouched by any experience that passes through it. Rest in this understanding, and let the natural peace of your deepest being carry you gently into sleep. You are not the storm clouds of thought and emotion. You are the vast, open sky in which they briefly appear and disappear, leaving no trace behind. In the high mountains of ancient Tibet, where the wind carried the scent of snow even in summer and eagles soared between peaks that seemed to touch the heavens, there was a cave monastery called Fearless Peak. The monastery was carved directly into the cliff face, its rooms connected by narrow stone pathways that hung suspended over vast drops into the valley below. One autumn, a young monk named Pema arrived at Fearless Peak, seeking to deepen his meditation practice under the guidance of the monastery's renowned master, Lama Thubten. Pema was intelligent and deeply sincere about his spiritual development, but he carried within him a burden that made his progress difficult. He was profoundly afraid of being alone. This fear had shadowed Pema since childhood. Whenever he found himself in solitude, especially in quiet or dark places, his mind would fill with anxious thoughts, and his body would tense with a nameless dread that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. During group meditations, he felt peaceful and focused, drawing strength from the presence of others. But when he tried to practice alone in his small stone cell, fear would overwhelm him, making concentration impossible. At Fearless Peak, the traditional practice was for each monk to spend one night each month in solitary retreat in what was called the Silence Cave, a small chamber deeper in the mountain where practitioners could experience complete stillness and isolation. For most monks, this was a cherished opportunity for profound inner work. For Pema, the very thought of it created overwhelming anxiety. For his first 3 months at the monastery, Pema found creative excuses to avoid his solitary retreat. He would volunteer for kitchen duty when his turn approached, claiming that the community's needs were more important than his personal practice. He would develop convenient illnesses that required him to stay near the infirmary. He would offer to take the place of other monks who had monastery business to attend to during their retreat times. Master Thubten observed Pema's pattern with the patient wisdom of someone who had guided many struggling students through their deepest fears. The old Lama's face was deeply lined from decades of mountain weather and spiritual practice, but his eyes held a warmth that seemed capable of melting even the most frozen heart. Finally, on a morning when frost painted the mountain peaks silver and the air was so clear it seemed to ring like a bell, Thubten called Pema to his simple chambers. They sat together drinking butter tea beside a small brazier that glowed with steady warmth, the only sound the soft crackling of dried yak dung burning in the metal bowl. "My young friend," Thubten said as he poured tea into Pema's wooden cup, his movements slow and deliberate, "I notice you have not yet taken your solitary retreat. Are you perhaps waiting for a more auspicious time?" Pema's face flushed with shame. He had hoped his avoidance had gone unnoticed, but he should have known that nothing escaped the master's gentle attention. "Lama Thubten, I find it very difficult to be alone. When I am by myself, especially in silent places, I become extremely afraid. I don't understand why, but the fear is so overwhelming that I cannot meditate at all." Thubten nodded with deep understanding, his eyes reflecting no judgment, only compassion. "Fear is like a faithful dog, isn't it? It follows us everywhere, trying to protect us from dangers both real and imaginary. Tell me, what exactly are you afraid will happen when you are alone in the cave?" Pema thought carefully, trying to put his terror into words. "I'm not sure, Master. It's not that I think some specific danger will harm me. It's more like there's something dark waiting in the silence that I don't want to meet. Something about myself, perhaps, that I've been running from." "Ah," Thubten said, his eyes crinkling with recognition and what might have been relief. "You are afraid of meeting yourself completely. This is actually very common, and in truth, it shows wisdom. The mind instinctively knows that in deep silence, we must eventually face everything we have been avoiding." He set down his teacup and looked directly at Pema with infinite kindness. "Tonight, you will spend the night in Silence Cave, but you will not go alone." Pema felt a wave of relief wash through him. "You will come with me, Master?" "No," Thubten replied gently, his smile warm as sunlight. "You will go with your fear. Instead of trying to avoid it or overcome it, you will invite it to be your companion for the night. You will make friends with this faithful dog that has been trying so hard to protect you. That evening, as darkness settled over the mountains like a soft blanket studded with stars, Pema made his way along the narrow stone path to Silence Cave. His hands were trembling as he lit the small oil lamp and settled onto the meditation cushion in the center of the chamber. The cave was completely silent, except for the faint whisper of his own breathing and the almost inaudible flicker of the lamp's flame. Almost immediately, the familiar fear began to rise like water filling a vessel. His heart started beating faster. His breath became shallow and quick. The shadows cast by the lamp seemed to move and dance in threatening ways, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to flee back to the safety and companionship of the main monastery. But then he remembered Master Thubten's unusual instructions. Instead of fighting the fear or trying to push it away, Pema spoke to it quietly, as if addressing an old friend who had come to visit. "Hello, fear," he whispered into the darkness, his voice barely audible above his own heartbeat. "I know you're trying to protect me, and I'm grateful for that. Thank you for caring about my safety all these years. But I'm going to sit here tonight, and I'd like you to sit with me." The fear seemed surprised by this approach. Instead of the usual struggle and resistance it encountered, it found acceptance and even gratitude. Gradually, Pema began to sense the fear differently. It was like a small, frightened child who had been trying to get his attention through the only method it knew, creating anxiety and panic in an attempt to keep him safe from some ancient, half-remembered danger. As the night deepened and the oil in his lamp slowly burned lower, Pema continued his gentle dialogue with the fear. He acknowledged its presence without judgment. He thanked it for its years of vigilant service. He assured it that he was safe here in this sacred space, that there was nothing in the silence that could truly harm him. "I understand now," he said softly to the fear as the flame flickered in the lamp's bronze reservoir. "You've been trying to protect me from feeling alone and abandoned, haven't you? You learned long ago that being alone meant being unsafe, and you've been trying to save me from that ever since." Slowly, remarkably, the fear began to soften. Instead of the sharp, electric terror he had always known, Pema felt something more like sadness, a deep loneliness that had been hiding behind the anxiety for as long as he could remember. As he allowed himself to feel this loneliness fully, without trying to escape from it or fix it, something unexpected happened. In the very center of the loneliness, he discovered something else, a vast, warm presence that had been there all along, waiting patiently behind his fear. It was as if his terror of being alone had prevented him from discovering that he was never actually alone at all. There was always this deeper presence, this unchanging awareness that accompanied him everywhere, more intimate than his own breath. When the lamp finally flickered out near dawn, Pema sat in complete darkness and complete peace, no longer afraid of the silence or the solitude. He had met his fear with such complete acceptance that it had transformed into its opposite, a profound recognition of the constant companionship of his own deepest nature. This beautiful story reveals something profound about the nature of fear and how we can transform our relationship with it. Most of us treat fear as an enemy to be conquered or a weakness to be hidden, but Pema's experience shows us a different way. Fear as a teacher that has something important to show us about ourselves. Fear often develops as a protective mechanism, usually in childhood, when our young minds create strategies to keep us safe from real or perceived dangers. A child who feels abandoned might develop a fear of being alone. A child who is criticized harshly might develop a fear of making mistakes. A child who witnesses conflict might develop a fear of expressing their own needs. These protective strategies serve their purpose for a time, but they often outlive their usefulness. What once kept us safe as children can become a prison that limits our freedom as adults. The mind that learned to fear being alone continues to create anxiety around solitude long after we're capable of taking care of ourselves. The mind that learned to fear failure continues to prevent us from taking necessary risks long after we've developed the resilience to handle setbacks. The key insight in Pema's story is that fighting against fear often makes it stronger, while approaching it with curiosity and compassion can transform it completely. When we resist fear, we're essentially telling it that it's dangerous, which confirms its message that something is wrong. But when we welcome fear, as Pema learned to do, we discover that it's usually trying to protect us from something that's no longer actually threatening. This approach requires tremendous courage, but it's a different kind of courage than we usually imagine. It's not the courage to be fearless, but the courage to be present with fear. It's not the courage to conquer our emotions, but the courage to meet them with understanding. When you feel afraid, you can try Pema's approach. Instead of immediately trying to get rid of the fear or talk yourself out of it, you can acknowledge it directly. Hello, fear. I notice you're here. What are you trying to protect me from? Often, just this simple recognition begins to shift something. Fear loses much of its power when it's met with awareness rather than resistance. You might discover, as Pema did, that your fear is guarding something precious. Maybe your fear of rejection is protecting your deep desire to be loved. Maybe your fear of failure is protecting your longing to contribute something meaningful. Maybe your fear of being alone is protecting your need for connection and belonging. When you see fear this way, it becomes possible to appreciate its positive intention while gently questioning whether its protective strategy is still necessary. You can thank your fear for trying to keep you safe while reassuring it that you're now capable of handling the situation it's worried about. This same approach works with shame, fear's close cousin. Shame is often fear's way of trying to prevent us from being rejected by others. It whispers that we're not good enough, smart enough, worthy enough, hoping that by keeping us small and hidden, it can protect us from the pain of criticism or abandonment. But shame, like fear, often outlives its usefulness. The child who learned that being seen was dangerous grows into an adult who hides their gifts from the world. The child who learned that making mistakes brought harsh punishment becomes an adult who never tries anything challenging. The antidote to shame is the same as the antidote to fear: gentle awareness and self-compassion. Instead of fighting against shameful feelings or trying to convince yourself they're wrong, you can acknowledge them with kindness. I notice shame arising. This part of me is trying to protect me from rejection. Thank you for caring about my well-being. When shame is met with this kind of understanding acceptance, it often reveals what it's really protecting: your tender heart, your deep desire to belong, your longing to be seen and appreciated for who you truly are. These are beautiful, human needs that deserve compassion, not judgment. Both fear and shame lose their grip on us when we stop seeing them as enemies and start seeing them as messengers. They're usually pointing towards something important: a wound that needs healing, a need that requires attention, or a part of ourselves that has been exiled and wants to come home. The practice is to approach these difficult emotions the way Pema learned to approach his fear, with curiosity, kindness, and patience. Not trying to fix them or get rid of them, but creating space for them to be present and to share what they have to teach us. This kind of inner work takes time and gentleness. You can't force emotional healing any more than you can force a flower to bloom by pulling on its petals. But you can create the conditions for transformation by offering your own difficult emotions the same compassion you would offer a frightened child. In a small village at the foot of Mount Fuji, where cherry trees lined the streets and the sound of temple bells drifted through the morning air, there lived a potter whose workshop had been passed down through 5 generations of his family. The potter's name was Kenji, and he was known throughout the region for creating vessels of extraordinary beauty and perfect craftsmanship. Kenji had learned his art from his father, who had learned from his father before him, in an unbroken lineage of masters stretching back over 2 centuries. Every technique, every secret of the clay and the fire had been carefully preserved and transmitted. The family's reputation was built on creating flawless works that were treasured by tea masters and collectors throughout Japan. This legacy was both Kenji's greatest pride and his heaviest burden. From childhood, he had been taught that anything less than perfection was failure, that a single flaw could destroy the honor of generations of master craftsmen. He worked with meticulous care, discarding countless pieces that contained even the smallest imperfection. One day, a young man named Hiroshi came to Kenji's workshop asking to become an apprentice. Hiroshi was the son of a farmer, with rough hands and no experience with clay, but his eyes held a deep love for beautiful things and a sincere desire to learn. Kenji agreed to teach him, though he wondered if someone from such humble beginnings could ever master the refined art his family had perfected. Hiroshi threw himself into learning with wholehearted enthusiasm. He arrived at the workshop before dawn and stayed until well after sunset, practicing the basic movements again and again. His early attempts were clumsy and crude, but he approached each failure with good humor and determination. As months passed, Hiroshi's skill improved steadily. His vessels became more elegant, his glazes more sophisticated. But he had one persistent problem. No matter how careful he was, many of his pieces developed small cracks during the firing process. Some cracked while cooling in the kiln, others developed hairline fractures days or weeks later. Each time Hiroshi discovered a crack in one of his pieces, he would bring it to Kenji with deep shame, apologizing profusely for his failure and begging to understand what he was doing wrong. Kenji would examine the piece, point out the technical flaws that had led to the crack, and then watch as Hiroshi smashed the vessel against the stone floor of the workshop, his face dark with self-reproach. "A true craftsman creates only perfect pieces," Hiroshi would say as he swept up the shards. "These failures dishonor the tradition you've shared with me." This pattern continued for over a year. Hiroshi's uncracked pieces became increasingly beautiful, but his shame over the flawed ones grew deeper. He began to see each crack as evidence of his fundamental unworthiness, proof that he would never measure up to the standards of the masters who had come before him. One morning, Kenji arrived at his workshop to find Hiroshi sitting on the floor, surrounded by the broken shards of what had clearly been his finest work yet. The pieces showed remarkable skill and artistic vision, but a single crack had run down one side of the main vessel. Hiroshi's eyes were red with tears of frustration and disappointment. "I can't do this anymore, Master," Hiroshi said without looking up. "I've been trying for more than a year, and I still can't create a perfect piece. Maybe I'm just not meant to be a potter. Maybe I should return to farming where my failures won't dishonor an ancient tradition." Kenji looked at the beautiful shards scattered across his workshop floor, then at his despairing student. Something in the young man's genuine anguish touched a place in Kenji's heart that had been closed for many years. Without saying a word, he walked to a special cabinet that Hiroshi had never seen opened. From the cabinet, Kenji removed a tea bowl unlike anything Hiroshi had ever seen. It was clearly very old, its surface marked by a network of fine golden lines that caught the morning light like captured sunbeams. The entire piece seemed to glow with warmth and character. "This bowl," Kenji said softly, "was made by my great-great-grandfather, the founder of our family tradition. It is our most treasured possession, worth more than everything else in this workshop combined." Hiroshi looked at the bowl in amazement, but also confusion. "Master, forgive me, but it's covered in cracks." "Yes," Kenji said, his voice filled with a gentleness Hiroshi had never heard before. "This bowl was broken completely during an earthquake when my great-great-grandfather was still alive. Instead of throwing it away, he mended it using a technique called kintsugi, filling the cracks with lacquer mixed with powdered gold." He held the bowl up to catch the light streaming through the workshop window. "Look closely, Hiroshi. The cracks are not flaws to be hidden. They have become the most beautiful part of the piece. They tell the story of the bowl's journey, its resilience, its ability to be broken and made whole again." Hiroshi stared at the golden veins running through the ceramic, beginning to understand something that would change his entire relationship with his craft and with himself. "My great-great-grandfather taught that our cracks do not make us less than we were before," Kenji continued. "They make us more beautiful, more valuable, more worthy of admiration. A perfect bowl that has never been tested, never been broken, never been mended, tells no story. But a bowl that has been shattered and lovingly repaired tells the story of resilience, of love, of the beauty that comes from accepting our imperfections." With infinite care, Kenji gathered the pieces of Hiroshi's broken vessel from the workshop floor. "Would you like to learn kintsugi?" he asked. "Would you like to learn how to make this piece more beautiful than it ever was when it was perfect? 0, 5, through tears of relief and recognition, Hiroshi nodded. As they worked together to mend the broken pottery with threads of gold, both master and student discovered something profound about the nature of true beauty and the healing power of embracing our flaws rather than hiding them. This story reveals something beautiful about shame and how we can transform our relationship with our perceived failures and imperfections. Most of us are taught, like Hiroshi, that our worth depends on being flawless, that any crack in our performance or character makes us less valuable, less lovable, less worthy of respect. But the art of kintsugi teaches us something radically different. Our breaks and cracks, our failures and imperfections can become the most beautiful and valuable parts of who we are. When we learn to honor our wounds rather than hide them, when we find ways to mend ourselves with golden care rather than throwing ourselves away, we discover a beauty that untested perfection could never achieve. Shame tells us that our flaws make us fundamentally defective, that we must hide our struggles and failures to be worthy of love and acceptance. It whispers that everyone else has figured out how to be perfect while we alone are broken. But this is one of shame's cruelest lies. Every human being has cracks, has been broken in some way, has areas where they feel inadequate or wounded. The difference between those who suffer under shame and those who have learned to transform it lies not in the presence or absence of flaws, but in how we relate to our imperfections. When we try to hide our cracks, they remain sources of pain and vulnerability. But when we learn to acknowledge them with the same kind of loving attention that the potter brought to mending broken pottery, they can become sources of wisdom, compassion, and authentic beauty. This doesn't mean celebrating our mistakes or refusing to grow and improve. It means recognizing that our struggles and failures are not evidence of our unworthiness, but proof of our courage to try, to risk, to be vulnerable in a world that often feels unsafe. The golden lines in kintsugi pottery represent something profound about healing. They don't try to make the cracks invisible or pretend the breaking never happened. Instead, they honor the history of the piece, acknowledging that this bowl has a story, has been tested by life, has survived something difficult, and emerged more beautiful because of it. In your own life, you can practice this art of golden repair with your emotional wounds and perceived failures. Instead of trying to hide the places where you've been broken, you can learn to see them as part of your unique beauty. The divorce that taught you about resilience. The job loss that forced you to discover hidden strengths. The betrayal that deepened your capacity for compassion. The failure that humbled your ego and opened your heart. This doesn't mean romanticizing suffering or seeking out painful experiences. It means learning to extract wisdom and beauty from the difficulties that inevitably come to every human life. It means refusing to throw yourself away because you've been cracked, choosing instead to mend yourself with golden threads of self-compassion and understanding. When shame arises about your perceived inadequacies, you can remember the lesson of kintsugi. Your flaws are not defects that make you worthless. They're evidence that you've lived, that you've been willing to risk failure in pursuit of something meaningful. They're part of your story, part of what makes you uniquely beautiful. The practice is to approach your own imperfections with the same loving attention that a master craftsman brings to mending precious pottery. Not rushing to fix everything or pretending nothing is broken, but taking time to honor what has been damaged and find ways to repair it that create new forms of beauty. This might mean seeking therapy to heal old wounds, talking honestly with friends about your struggles, or simply treating yourself with the kindness you would offer a dear friend who was going through difficulties. It means learning to see your scars not as signs of weakness, but as evidence of your strength, your willingness to heal, your capacity to transform pain into wisdom. When you learn to practice this golden repair on yourself, you naturally become more compassionate toward others. You begin to see that everyone is walking around with their own invisible cracks, their own hidden struggles, their own need for gentle mending. This recognition dissolves the isolation that shame creates and connects you to the shared human experience of being beautifully, imperfectly whole. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, you can bring this spirit of golden repair to any areas of shame or self-criticism that may be active in your mind. Instead of trying to fix these feelings or judge yourself for having them, you can offer them the same gentle attention you would bring to mending something precious that had been broken. Your imperfections are not obstacles to your worth. They're part of what makes you irreplaceably valuable. Like the golden lines in Japanese pottery, they tell the story of a life fully lived, fully risked, fully loved. Rest in this understanding and let the gentle art of self-compassion fill any cracks in your heart with threads of pure gold. In a quiet temple nestled in the hills outside Kyoto, where bamboo groves swayed gently in the evening breeze and the sound of a small stream provided constant peaceful music, there lived a monk whose contemplative life was about to be dramatically disrupted. Brother Jishin had spent 3 years at Tranquil Waters Temple, developing a deep meditation practice and finding profound peace in the predictable rhythms of monastic life. He rose before dawn for sitting practice, worked quietly in the temple gardens during the day, and spent his evenings in study and reflection. His cell was simple, but perfectly arranged, his mind clear and calm, his heart filled with contentment. The source of his disruption arrived on a humid summer morning in the form of his new neighbor. The house next to the temple had been empty for months, but now it had been purchased by a man named Tanaka, who seemed to possess no understanding whatsoever of the peaceful atmosphere that the monks worked so hard to maintain. Tanaka was a merchant who dealt in metal goods, and he had decided to set up a workshop behind his house where he could craft his wares. From early morning until late evening, the sound of hammering, sawing, and metal grinding shattered the tranquil silence that Jishin had come to cherish. But the noise was only the beginning. Tanaka had a loud voice that he used liberally, calling out to his workers, haggling with customers, and engaging in boisterous conversations that carried clearly across the temple grounds. He seemed to conduct his business as if the entire neighborhood were his workshop, with no consideration for others who might value quiet. Worse still, Tanaka appeared to take particular delight in starting his loudest work precisely during the temple's meditation times. The morning sitting period, which had always been Jishin's most peaceful hour, became an exercise in enduring the rhythmic pounding of metal on metal. The evening contemplation, once a time of deep reflection, was now punctuated by the grating sound of saws cutting through wood and iron. Within a week, Jishin's carefully cultivated peace had evaporated. During meditation, instead of attending to his breath, he found himself listening for the next disruption, his jaw clenched with anticipation of more noise. When silence did occur, he couldn't relax into it because he knew it was only temporary. His frustration grew daily. He began to have elaborate fantasies about confronting Tanaka, imagining speeches about respect and consideration for others. He plotted ways to complain to local authorities about noise violations. He even considered requesting a transfer to another temple, despite his deep love for tranquil waters. One morning, after a particularly sleepless night filled with late evening hammering, Jishin went to see the temple's abbot, Master Iko. Iko was an elderly monk with eyes that seemed to hold both infinite patience and subtle humor, someone who had guided the temple community through many challenges over the decades. "Master," Jishin said, trying to keep his voice calm and respectful, "I need to speak with you about our neighbor. His noise-making is destroying the peaceful atmosphere of our temple. Surely we must do something to protect our practice environment." Master Eko listened quietly as Jishin described his struggle with Tanaka's disruptions, his attempts to meditate through the noise, his growing anger and frustration. When Jishin finished his complaint, the master sat in silence for several long minutes, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me, Brother Jishin," Iko said finally, "what do you think this man is here to teach you?" Jishin was taken aback by the question. "Teach me?" "Master, he's not teaching anything. He's preventing me from learning by destroying our quiet environment." "Really?" Eiko asked, his eyes twinkling with gentle amusement. "You have been practicing meditation for 3 years in perfect silence. You have developed the ability to concentrate when conditions are ideal. But what happens when conditions are not ideal? What happens when life does not cooperate with your preferences?" Jishin felt something shift inside him, a small crack in his certainty about who was right and who was wrong in this situation. "This merchant," Iko continued, "has appeared at exactly the right time to show you where your practice is still incomplete. Any student can find peace in a perfectly quiet environment. But can you find peace when life is noisy, chaotic, and uncooperative? Can you maintain equanimity when others don't behave as you think they should? The master gestured toward the window, where the faint sound of Tanaka's morning work was already beginning. Your neighbor is offering you advanced training in patience, acceptance, and non-attachment. He is showing you that true peace cannot depend on external conditions. If your serenity can be destroyed by the sound of hammering, how deep is it really? Jishin sat in silence, realizing that he had been seeing his situation completely backwards. He had been viewing Tanaka as an obstacle to his spiritual development when he was actually being offered an extraordinary opportunity for growth. But Master, how do I practice with such constant disturbance? The same way you practiced with constant silence, Iko replied. You sit, you breathe, you observe whatever arises, whether it's the sound of a bell or the sound of a hammer. The practice is not to control your environment, but to maintain awareness regardless of what your environment contains. That evening, Jishin approached his meditation with completely new understanding. When Tanaka's hammering began, instead of tensing against it, Jishin included it in his awareness. Instead of seeing it as disruption, he experienced it as part of the rich texture of life unfolding around him. Instead of fighting for quiet, he found a deeper quiet that could hold all sounds without being disturbed by them. Over the following months, Jishin's practice deepened in ways he had never imagined possible. He learned to meditate in conditions that would have been impossible before. More importantly, he developed the kind of inner stability that remained unshaken regardless of external circumstances. When Tanaka eventually moved his workshop to a different location, Jishin found himself almost missing the challenges his neighbor had provided. The merchant had been, without knowing it, one of the most effective meditation teachers Jishin had ever encountered. Most of us go through life with an unconscious expectation that other people should behave in ways that make our lives easier and more pleasant. When they don't, when they're loud when we want quiet, busy when we want calm, demanding when we want space, we automatically assume something is wrong and needs to be fixed. But what if these challenging people are actually serving an essential function in our spiritual development? What if they're showing up in our lives precisely because we need to learn something that only they can teach us? 5. Jishin's story shows how a shift in perspective can transform what seems like an obstacle into an opportunity. His neighbor wasn't actually preventing him from practicing meditation. He was providing a different, more challenging form of meditation practice. The noise wasn't destroying the conditions for inner peace. It was revealing how conditional and fragile that peace had been. This principle applies to all kinds of difficult relationships. The colleague who constantly interrupts you might be teaching you about patience and the skill of maintaining your center when others are chaotic. The family member who criticizes you might be showing you where you're still dependent on external approval for your sense of worth. The friend who's always late might be offering you lessons in acceptance and letting go of the need to control others' behavior.